screen door slapped shut behind me before anyone noticed I was there. I'd driven 6 hours from Asheville with a tin of pecan shortbread on the passenger seat, the kind Lila used to ask for every Christmas when she was small, and I held that tin against my chest now like it was the only thing keeping me upright. The kitchen was loud. Not the warm loud of a family Sunday, but the loud of strangers. A country music station playing tinny from somebody's phone. A man laughing too hard at his own joke. The clatter of pans being moved without care. I smelled bacon grease and cigarette smoke. And beneath all of it, faintly, my daughter's lavender hand soap, like a memory pushed into the corner. Lila was at the sink. Her hair was scraped back into a bun so tight, it pulled the skin at her temples. She wore a sweatshirt I didn't recognize, 3 sizes too big, and she was scrubbing a cast iron skillet that wasn't hers. When she looked up and saw me, she didn't smile. She just blinked, slow, like she was trying to decide whether I was real. "Mama." That's all she said. A woman came around the corner from the pantry holding a glass casserole dish, and she stopped short when she saw me. Pearl Cunningham, my son-in-law's mother. I'd only met her twice, once at the wedding, once at a baby shower for Hayes's niece, and both times she'd looked through me like I was a draft from a window. She looked at me that way now. Then she looked at Lila. "Tell your mother dinner's at 6, she said, "if she's staying." She walked past me into the dining room. She didn't say hello. She didn't ask why I'd come. She just carried that casserole dish through my daughter's house like she'd done it every night of her life. I set the tin of shortbread on the counter. Lila glanced at it, and for half a second her face cracked open and I saw her, my Lila, the one who'd called me crying from her dorm room about a boy in her botany class, the one who'd painted her childhood bedroom 3 different shades of yellow before she found the right one. Then the crack sealed up again, and she went back to scrubbing the skillet. "How long have they been here, honey?" She didn't answer. She just kept scrubbing. "I want to back up. I want to tell you how we got to that kitchen." 6 months earlier, I'd signed the closing papers on a 40-acre piece of land outside Boone, North Carolina, with a cedar farmhouse on it and an old tobacco barn that hadn't been worked in 20 years. The realtor was a woman named Marjorie who wore too much perfume and kept calling me ma'am in a way that suggested she thought I might lose my nerve. I didn't lose my nerve. I wrote the check. I put the deed in Lila's name. Hers alone, not Hayes's, not jointly, not anything that could be argued over later. I'd been a probate paralegal for 31 years before I retired. I knew what a marriage could turn into when paper was involved. I gave Lila the keys at her kitchen table in Charlotte, the one she and Hayes had been renting since their wedding. Hayes wasn't home. He never was those days. Lila had been quiet for months. Not sad quiet, exactly. More like she was conserving something, speaking less so she'd have more left over later. I'd watched her shrink an inch at a time over 4 years of marriage, and I told myself it was adjustment. It was the stress of trying for a baby. It was Hayes's job. It was anything but what it was. When I slid the deed across the table, she stared at it for a long time. "Mama, this is too much." "It isn't." "What if?" She stopped, pressed her fingers against her mouth. "What if it doesn't fix anything?" "It isn't supposed to fix anything. It's supposed to be yours." She didn't cry. She just folded the deed in half and held it the way you hold a small bird. Then she said, "Hayes is going to be upset." I didn't ask why. I should have. I've thought about that since. They moved up to the farm in April. Lila called me twice in the first month, sounding lighter than she had in years. She told me about the dogwoods on the back hill, about a sweet old woman next door who brought her a jar of sourwood honey, about the way the light came through the kitchen window at 5 in the afternoon and made the whole room look gold. The third month, the call stopped. I called her instead. She sounded tired. Then she sounded fine, which is worse than tired. By month 5, I was getting answers like "everything's good, just busy" in texts that came at 3 in the afternoon when she should have been outside painting. Lila used to paint. Watercolors mostly? Wildflowers and old fences? She hadn't sent me a picture of anything she'd made since June, so I drove up unannounced. That's how I ended up standing in her kitchen with a tin of shortbread, watching Pearl Cunningham carry a casserole into my daughter's dining room like she owned the place. That first night, I counted them. Pearl, Hayes's father Dell, a long, quiet man who chewed tobacco and spit it into an empty Pepsi can he kept beside his recliner. The recliner that hadn't been in the living room the last time I'd visited. Hayes's sister Brandy and her husband Cody and their 2 boys, ages maybe 7 and 4, who were running barefoot through the hallway with sticky hands. And Hayes's brother Tucker, who didn't seem to have a wife with him. Just a duffel bag in the corner of the guest room, and a habit of cracking open a Coors at 10 in the morning. 7 extra people in my daughter's farmhouse. 8, counting Hayes, who came in from the barn around 6 smelling like diesel and didn't say a word to me. He nodded, that was it. He sat down at the head of the table, at the head of my daughter's table, and Pearl set a plate down in front of him before she set one down for anyone else. Lila served herself last. I noticed that. I noticed the way she waited until Pearl had passed the green beans before she reached for them. I noticed the way Brandy's older boy climbed into Lila's lap with sticky fingers and Lila just sat there, letting him smear barbecue sauce on the only nice blouse I'd ever seen her wear up here. I noticed there was no place set for me until I cleared my throat, and even then it was Lila who jumped up to get a plate, not Pearl, who'd cooked the meal in my daughter's kitchen using my daughter's pans. After dinner, Lila walked me out to the porch. The air smelled like rain and cut grass. She lit a citronella candle on the railing, and we stood there with the mountains going purple in the distance. Hayes's daddy had a stroke in May, she said. A small one. They came up to help out till he got his strength back. Honey, it's October. I know. Where are they all sleeping? She didn't look at me. Pearl and Dell took our bedroom. They needed the king bed for Dell's back. Brandy and Cody are in the guest room with the boys. Tucker's on the pullout. And you and Hayes? The little room off the kitchen, the one I was going to make into a studio. I didn't say anything for a long minute. I watched a moth bump itself stupid against the porch light. Lila, don't, Mama? I'm just asking. Please don't. So I didn't. Not that night. I slept on the couch in the living room. Pearl had made it up for me with the quilt I recognized. My mother's quilt, the double wedding ring pattern, the one I'd given Lila when she got married. It smelled like someone else's perfume. I lay there listening to the house. Tucker snored from the pullout. A toilet flushed somewhere. Around midnight, I heard Pearl's voice, low and sharp, from the bedroom that used to be my daughter's. I couldn't make out the words, just the tone of a woman who decided a long time ago she was the one in charge. The next morning, I got up early and walked the property. I wanted to see what Lila had done with it. The garden bed she'd written me about in May was overgrown with crabgrass. The little chicken coop she'd built had a piece of plywood nailed across the door. No chickens. The tobacco barn she'd said she wanted to convert into a studio had a tarp thrown over one corner where the roof had started to leak. But inside, when I pushed the door open, I found something that stopped me in the doorway. Her easel was folded against the back wall. A wooden box of watercolor tubes sat on a workbench, half buried under a pile of motor oil bottles and a tangle of jumper cables. A stretched canvas was propped behind a riding mower, primer white, untouched. And on the floor, against the far wall, was a coffee mug. I knew that mug. I bought it for her at a craft fair in Black Mountain when she was a junior in college. It was hand-thrown stoneware, glazed the color of a robin's egg, with her initials pressed into the bottom by the potter himself. She'd carried it through 4 apartments and 1 marriage. She drank her morning coffee out of it every day of her life that I knew of. It was sitting on the concrete floor of the barn with a cigarette butt floating in an inch of cold coffee. I picked it up. I poured out the coffee and the cigarette into the dirt outside the door. I rinsed the mug under the spigot on the side of the barn until my fingers went numb, and I wrapped it in my cardigan and carried it back to the house and tucked it into my suitcase. I'd been a paralegal for 31 years. I'd watched a lot of women get bullied out of their own homes a quarter inch at a time. I knew what it looked like. I just never expected to see it happening to mine. That afternoon, I helped Lila bring in the laundry. She had a basket of her own clothes that had been sitting on top of the dryer for, by the look of it, a week. Pearl's clothes were folded in neat stacks on the kitchen table. Brandy's boys' clothes were spread across the back of every chair. Lila's were in a wrinkled heap, and when she shook out a blouse, I saw that her hands were chapped raw across the knuckles. Split skin, the kind you get from washing dishes in water that's too hot, over and over for weeks. Where are your good gloves, honey? I lost them. You lost them. You lost them. Pearl said they smelled like mildew. She threw them out. I folded the blouse in my hands very carefully. I set it on top of the basket. I did not say anything, because if I had spoken in that moment, I would have said something I couldn't take back, and I needed Lila on my side before I said it. That night at dinner, Hayes finally looked at me. It was halfway through the meal. Pearl was telling a long story about a woman in her church who'd had the audacity to wear white to a granddaughter's baptism, and Hayes glanced up across the table and caught my eye and held it for maybe 2 seconds before he looked back down at his plate. There was something in that look, not apology, not quite shame, more like a man who knows the house is on fire and has decided he's too tired to get up. He'd loved her once. I'd been at the wedding. I'd watched him cry when she walked down the aisle. I don't know exactly when he chose his mother over his wife. I don't think it was one moment. I think it was 1,000 small moments, and by the time it was done, he didn't remember choosing at all. After dinner, I asked Lila if she'd take a walk with me. We went down the gravel drive toward the road, far enough that the porch light didn't reach us. The sky was full of stars. There are stars in Asheville, too. But not like that. Not like the stars above a 40-acre piece of land that belongs to your daughter on paper and to somebody else's mother in every other way. Honey, I said. Mama, please. I need to ask you one thing. Please don't ask me to make them leave. I can't. Hayes says his daddy needs the air up here. He says Pearl's been a wreck since the stroke. He says it's just a little longer. How much longer? I don't know. Has he said? He gets angry when I ask. Angry how? She didn't answer. Lila, angry how? Not like that. He doesn't, Mama, he doesn't hit me. He just goes quiet. For days. He sleeps on the couch and he doesn't speak to me, and Pearl tells the kids Mama Lila is in a mood again. And then it goes on like that until I apologize. For what? She laughed. It was the worst sound I'd heard in years. I don't know anymore. I took her hand. Her hand was so cold. We stood there in the gravel under all those stars, and I felt something settle in my chest that had been circling for hours. Not anger. Anger comes and goes. This was the other thing. The thing my own mother used to call her steady. The thing you find when you've already decided and you're just waiting for your body to catch up. I'm going into town tomorrow morning, I told her. I need to run an errand. I'll be back by lunch. Okay, honey, look at me. She looked at me. You don't owe them anything. Not the bed. Not the kitchen. Not your hands. You don't owe them one single thing. She didn't say anything, but she squeezed my hand before she let go. I left at 6 the next morning, before anyone else was up. I drove into Boone and parked in front of the Wattagakont Register of Deeds office and waited in my car for 40 minutes until they unlocked the door. I'd brought the original deed with me from Asheville. I'd brought my driver's license. I brought a folder with the closing documents and the title insurance and a notarized copy of the gift letter I'd had drawn up when I transferred the property to Lila. I brought all of it because I'd been a paralegal for 31 years, and I knew that the side that walks in with the paperwork is the side that walks out with the win. I requested a certified copy of the deed showing Lila as the sole owner of record. Then I drove 3 blocks over to a lawyer's office I'd called the night before from the porch, after Lila went to bed. His name was Marvin Holcomb. He was 68 years old, and his secretary had told me on the phone that he didn't usually take walk-ins, but when I'd explained the situation, she'd said, "Honey, you come on in at 8:30. He'll see you." Marvin Holcomb's to my papers for about 90 seconds. Then he looked up over his reading glasses. "You want a notice to vacate?" "Yes, sir." "For everyone except your daughter?" "Yes, sir, including the son-in-law." I had to think about that one. Not long, just long enough to be sure. That's up to my daughter. I want notices drawn up for the in-laws. Pearl, Dell, Brandy, Cody, Tucker, and the 2 grandchildren. Properly named, properly dated. 30 days under North Carolina law, but I want them to understand it starts the minute they read it. You want me to come serve 'em? I'd appreciate that. You sure you don't want a sheriff's deputy with me? Sometimes folks get spirited. Mr. Vay. Holcomb, my daughter has been bullied in her own house for 5 months. I don't want a deputy. I want a witness. He smiled at me then. It was a small, mean, satisfied smile. The smile of a man who'd been waiting all morning for somebody to give him something interesting to do. Yes, ma'am. Be there at 2. I drove back. I stopped at a diner on the way and ate a piece of coconut cream pie and drank 2 cups of coffee and didn't taste any of it. When I pulled up at the farm, Pearl was on the porch in a rocking chair with a glass of sweet tea, watching Brandy's boys throw rocks at the chicken coop. She didn't get up when I came up the steps. She didn't say hello. She just said, "We were starting to wonder if you'd left." "No, ma'am," I said. "I had business in town." I went inside. Lila was at the kitchen sink. I touched her elbow and she turned around and I said quietly, "I need you to come sit with me at the table. There's going to be a man here at 2. Everything's all right, but I want you next to me." She nodded. She didn't ask what man. Marvin Holcomb pulled up at 158. He had a brown leather briefcase and a navy sport coat and a tie with little ducks on it, and he came up the porch steps like a man going to a Rotary lunch. Pearl stood up when he tipped his hat to her. I think she thought he was selling something. I called everyone into the kitchen. I had to call twice for Tucker, who was watching a game in the living room. Hayes came in last, wiping his hands on a shop rag. Pearl stood at the head of the table where she always stood. I sat at the foot. Lila sat next to me. Marvin Holcomb stood by the back door with his briefcase open. "My name is Marvin Holcomb," he said. "I'm an attorney licensed in the state of North Carolina. I'm here at the request of Mrs. Immuno, Eleanor Whitfield, to deliver legal notices to the following individuals." He read the names: Pearl Cunningham, Dell Cunningham, Brandy Cunningham, Zare, Cody Sayre, Tucker Cunningham, and the 2 children named in their parents' notices as minors. He laid the papers on the table. Pearl picked hers up. Her face went a color I'd never seen on a human being before, somewhere between gray and red. "What in the hell? Mom, these are notices to vacate. You have 30 days from today's date, October the 14th, to remove yourselves and your belongings from this property. The property is owned solely by Mrs. Lila Cunningham, my client's daughter, and she has not extended any tenancy to any of you. You are guests. Guests can be asked to leave. You are being asked." Hayes was staring at the table. "Mama," he said, "what is this?" I looked at him. "This is what should have happened in June," I said. "I'm sorry it didn't." Pearl turned on Lila. "You let her do this. You let your mother walk in here and treat us like—" "Pearl." It was Lila. Her voice was very quiet, but it was a voice I hadn't heard in a long time. It was the voice she used when she was 16 and a boy at the swimming pool said something ugly about her best friend. "You threw out my gloves," Lila said. "You moved into my bedroom. You put my coffee mug in the barn. You told my husband I was being difficult when I asked you to use a coaster on my grandmother's table. You have been in my house for 5 months and you have never once asked me what I wanted in it. Lila Marie, you have 30 days. I'd rather it was less." Pearl opened her mouth and closed it and opened it again. Dell stood up slowly from his chair and put his hand on her arm. He hadn't said 3 words to me the whole visit. He didn't say anything now either. He just steered Pearl out of the kitchen and down the hall, and the screen door slapped shut behind them like punctuation. Hayes was still looking at the table. "Lila, don't." "Baby, she didn't mean don't." He stood up. He looked at me. There was a long moment where I think he wanted to say something to me, something accusatory or something pleading. I couldn't tell which. Then he walked past me out the back door, toward the barn, and Marvin Holcomb closed his briefcase and tipped his hat to Lila and said, "Ma'am, my card's on the table if you need anything further," and he let himself out. The house was quiet for about an hour. Then it wasn't. I'll spare you most of it. Brandy cried in the hallway and called Lila a name I won't repeat. Cody slammed doors. Tucker tried to corner me in the kitchen and tell me I was a bitter old woman ruining a good family, and I told him my husband had been dead 7 years and I'd buried meaner men than him, and I went back to the porch. Pearl packed all night. I could hear her opening drawers that weren't hers, taking things she had no claim to. I let her. Things can be replaced. They were mostly gone by the next afternoon. Pearl was the last, like I knew she'd be. She came down the porch steps with a hat box and a vinyl suitcase, and she stopped at the bottom and looked back at the house. "You think you've won something," she said. I was sitting in the rocking chair with a cup of tea. I didn't get up. "No, ma'am," I said. "I don't think I've won anything." "I think my daughter has." She didn't have an answer for that. She got in the car. Dell drove. They went down the gravel drive and turned out onto the road, and the dust hung in the air a long time after they were gone. Hayes stayed 2 more days. He slept in the barn, I think. I don't know for sure. He came into the house once to get clothes, and Lila was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee in the robin's egg mug, and he stood in the doorway looking at her for a long time. I should have told them to leave. Yes, I didn't know how. I know. Lila? She set down the mug. Hayes, you knew how. You just didn't want to. He stood there another minute. Then he went and got his bag from the bedroom. He drove away that evening in his truck without saying goodbye to either of us. 6 weeks later, he filed for separation through a lawyer in Hickory. Lila didn't contest it. The farm was already hers. There was nothing to fight over. I stayed through Thanksgiving. We pulled my mother's quilt out of the closet and washed it twice in cold water and hung it in the sun until it didn't smell like Pearl's perfume anymore. We cleaned out the bedroom. We dragged Dell's recliner to the curb. We painted the little room off the kitchen the color of butter, and Lila set her easel up in the corner by the window. And one morning in late November, I came downstairs and found her there, with a wet brush in her hand and a half-finished watercolor of the dogwood on the back hill, and she was humming. Just a little, under her breath. Something tuneless from her childhood. I want to tell you it was all easy after that. It wasn't. There were nights she cried so hard I thought she'd break apart. There was a week in December where she didn't get out of bed except to feed the dog. There was a phone call from Pearl in January that I won't repeat the content of, and a letter from Hayes in February asking for things back that Lila no longer had and no longer cared about. But there was also this by March. Lila had cleared out the tobacco barn. By April, she'd hung 6 watercolors on the back wall and put a hand-painted sign by the road that said "Studio Open Saturdays." By May, 4 women from the church in town were coming up every Saturday morning with their own brushes and a thermos of coffee. And they sat at long tables in the barn and painted the mountains and laughed and brought my daughter casseroles and cornbread. And one of them brought her a pair of gardening gloves, brand new soft leather, because Lila had mentioned in passing that she'd lost her old ones. The robin's egg mug sits on a shelf above the kitchen sink. There's a hairline crack along the handle now, from where it got knocked against the spigot the day I rinsed it out in the barn. It still holds coffee. It still holds tea. It holds whatever you put in it, and it doesn't lose a drop. I drink out of it sometimes when I visit. Lila lets me. She doesn't say anything when I lift it down. She just smiles and goes back to whatever she was doing. And outside the kitchen window, the dogwood on the back hill is starting to put out its little white flowers, and the farm is quiet, and the farm is ours. I've thought a lot about that drive home from Boone, the long, quiet hours where the mountains turned to foothills and the foothills turned to the long, flat road back to Asheville. I kept turning the whole thing over in my head, trying to find the moment it had gone wrong. I wanted there to be one. A clean place to point to and say, there, that's where Pearl crossed the line. That's where Hayes stopped being the boy who'd cried at his own wedding. But the truth is, there wasn't one moment. There were 100 of them, and most of them happened while my daughter was telling herself it wasn't that bad yet. That's the thing nobody warns you about. Cruelty rarely arrives the way you expect it to. It doesn't kick in the door. It walks in carrying a casserole dish and a story about a stroke, and it sits down in your kitchen, and it stays. And every day that you don't ask it to leave is a day it learns it doesn't have to. I keep coming back to Lila's hands. The split knuckles. The chapped skin. I think about how she lost the habit of speaking up so gradually she didn't notice she'd lost it, and I think about how I almost didn't drive up to that farm in October. I almost told myself she was a grown woman, that I'd raised her right, that she'd ask for help if she needed it. Mercy, the things we tell ourselves to keep from having a hard conversation. I learned something up there I wish I'd learned 40 years sooner. Love that doesn't act isn't really love, it's just sentiment. The pearls of this world count on us being polite. They count on us not wanting to make a scene. And the longer we stay polite, the smaller the people we love become, until one day we look up and our daughter is serving herself last at her own dinner table, and we don't even remember when that started. What saved Lila wasn't me. I want to be clear about that. I brought the paperwork, but Lila is the one who looked Pearl in the eye and said her piece. That voice had been in her the whole time. It had just been waiting for somebody to make room for it. That's all most of us are doing for each other, I think, on our best days. Making room for the part of somebody that still knows who it is. If you're sitting with this story tonight and any of it feels familiar, the slow shrinking, the apologizing for things you can't name, the sense that your own house has stopped being yours, please hear me. You are allowed to ask people to leave. You are allowed to put your name on the paper and mean it. The kindest thing I ever did for my daughter wasn't buying her a farm. It was driving up uninvited and refusing to pretend I didn't see what I saw. Sometimes love looks like a notice to vacate. Sometimes it looks like a robin's egg mug, rinsed clean and put back where it belongs.